In the spring of 1943, a young German soldier named Hans Müller stood on the deck of a transport ship, watching the Statue of Liberty emerge through the morning fog. Just weeks earlier, he had been fighting in North Africa under Rommel's Afrika Korps. Now, as a prisoner of war, he was entering a country he had been taught to fear and hate. What he would discover in the coming months would shatter everything he believed about America and Americans. Between 1942 and 1946, more than 425,000 German prisoners of war were held in the United States. They were housed in over 500 camps scattered across the country, from the deserts of Arizona to the farmlands of Iowa, from the forests of Wisconsin to the plains of Texas. For most of these young men, brainwashed by years of Nazi propaganda, America was supposed to be a land of chaos, violence, and racial conflict. What they encountered instead would change their lives forever. When German POWs first arrived at American camps, many expected the worst. Under the Geneva Convention, prisoners were entitled to humane treatment, but the Nazis had told them that Americans would never honor such agreements. Some prisoners had hidden razor blades in their clothing, planning to take their own lives rather than face what they believed would be torture and execution. Instead, they were greeted with something completely unexpected: respect. George Gardner, who was held at a camp in New Mexico, later recalled, "We could not believe it. We were given clean barracks, real beds with mattresses and blankets. The American guards were stern but fair. No one beat us. No one starved us. We kept waiting for the other shoe to drop, but it never did." But nothing shocked the German prisoners more than the food. After years of wartime rationing in Germany, where even soldiers often went hungry, the Americans fed them meals that seemed impossibly abundant. Breakfast might include hot coffee, fresh eggs, bacon, toast with real butter, and orange juice. Lunch could be fried chicken, mashed potatoes, vegetables, fresh bread, and milk. Dinner might feature roast beef, gravy, more vegetables, dessert, and again, all the bread they wanted. Many prisoners initially thought it was a trick. They believed the Americans were fattening them up before executing them, just as the Nazis had told them Americans would do. One prisoner, Heinrich Matthias, remembered, "After the first week, we started to understand. This wasn't special treatment. This is how Americans ate. Even the guards ate the same food we did. Some of us actually gained weight as prisoners. Back home, our families were starving, and here we were, POWs, eating better than we had in years." The Geneva Convention required that prisoners of war be treated humanely, and the United States took this obligation seriously. POWs were housed in barracks with heating in winter and ventilation in summer. They had access to showers, medical care, and dental treatment. They could send and receive mail, though it was censored. They were paid for their labor, 80 cents a day in camp scrip, which they could spend at the camp canteen on items like cigarettes, candy, toiletries, and beer. Yes, beer. Many camps allowed prisoners to purchase beer, a privilege that seemed unthinkable to men who had expected to be treated as subhuman. With millions of American men fighting overseas, the United States faced severe labor shortages, particularly in agriculture. German POWs were put to work in fields and factories, harvesting crops, canning food, and performing other essential tasks. Under international law, POWs could not be forced to work in war industries, so they worked primarily in agriculture and food processing. They picked cotton in Texas, harvested sugar beets in Montana, cut timber in Maine, and picked fruit in California. For many prisoners, these work assignments provided their first real contact with ordinary Americans. And this is where the most profound transformations began. Despite official regulations limiting fraternization, meaningful interactions between POWs and American civilians were inevitable. Farmers who supervised prisoner work gangs often shared their lunches with the Germans. Small acts of kindness accumulated. A farmer's wife bringing cold lemonade on a hot day, a store owner allowing a prisoner to look at magazines, a child waving at the trucks carrying POWs back to camp. These simple human moments had a powerful effect on men who had been taught that Americans were their mortal enemies. Reinhold Pabel, a prisoner who worked on farms in Illinois, later wrote, "The propaganda had told us that Americans were soft, decadent, obsessed with money and pleasure. What we found were hardworking people who treated us with a fairness we had never known in our own military. Yes, they were casual and informal in ways that shocked us at first, but they were also honest, generous, and fundamentally decent. The American camp system didn't just house prisoners. It attempted to re-educate them. The U.S. government established programs to expose POWs to democratic ideas and to counter the Nazi ideology that had shaped their worldview. Prisoners had access to libraries stocked with books, newspapers, and magazines. They could attend classes taught by fellow prisoners or even by American instructors. They formed orchestras, theatrical groups, and sports teams. Some camps had their own newspapers, printed by the prisoners themselves. For many young Germans who had known nothing but Nazi propaganda since childhood, this exposure to free ideas was revolutionary. They began to question what they had been told about the world. As the war drew to a close in 1945, American authorities began showing German POWs documentary films about the liberation of concentration camps. The images of Auschwitz, Dachau, Bergen-Belsen, and other death camps confronted the prisoners with undeniable evidence of the Holocaust. Many refused to believe it at first. They insisted the films were propaganda, elaborate fabrications designed to make Germany look evil. But as more evidence accumulated, as they saw the skeletal survivors, the mountains of corpses, the gas chambers and crematoriums, denial became impossible. George Gartner recalled, "That was the moment everything changed for me. I had fought for Germany, for what I thought was my country's honor. And now I learned that my country had committed the greatest crime in human history." Some prisoners became angry, insisting it was all lies. Some fell into deep depression. I felt a shame so profound I didn't know how to carry it. The contrast between how Americans had treated them and how their own country had treated millions of innocents created a cognitive dissonance that many prisoners struggled to resolve. Here was the paradox that haunted German POWs. They, who had fought for Hitler's Reich, were being treated with dignity and respect by the very people they had tried to kill. Meanwhile, their own country had murdered millions of defenseless civilians in a systematic campaign of genocide. This paradox forced a moral reckoning that would shape the rest of their lives. Not everything was easy for the prisoners, of course. They were still captives, separated from their families, uncertain about their futures. Homesickness was pervasive. Letters from Germany brought news of bombing raids, advancing Soviet armies, and loved ones killed or missing. As Germany collapsed in the spring of 1945, many prisoners felt torn. Relief that the war was ending mixed with anxiety about what would happen to their homeland and grief for their country's defeat. But through it all, the fundamental decency of their treatment remained consistent. Even after V-Day in May 1945, when the full extent of Nazi atrocities became known and anti-German sentiment in America intensified, the treatment of POWs did not deteriorate into revenge or cruelty. The repatriation of German POWs began in 1946 and continued into 1947. For many prisoners, leaving America was bittersweet. They were eager to reunite with their families, but they were also returning to a Germany that lay in ruins, occupied by foreign armies, divided into zones, and facing an uncertain future. Many prisoners tried to find ways to stay in America. Some married American women they had met through correspondence or church groups. Others hoped to immigrate legally after their repatriation. The irony was inescapable. Men who had come to America as enemies now wanted to stay as friends. Hans Muller, the soldier we met at the beginning of our story, was repatriated to Germany in early 1946. He later wrote, "I returned to a country I barely recognized. The cities were rubble, the people were broken, and the future looked impossibly dark. But I carried with me something valuable, the memory of how a democratic society treats even its enemies. That memory would guide me as Germany struggled to rebuild itself into a democracy." The experience of German POWs in America had lasting effects that extended far beyond individual lives. Many of these men became advocates for democracy in post-war Germany. They had seen firsthand how a free society operated, how citizens could criticize their government without fear, how different races and religions could coexist, however imperfectly. They returned to Germany, with a different perspective on what their country could become. Some entered politics, business, or education, bringing with them the values they had observed in America. The story of German POWs in America reveals something important about the power of moral conviction during wartime. The United States was not perfect. It struggled with its own contradictions, particularly regarding race. Japanese Americans were unjustly imprisoned in internment camps, while German POWs enjoyed relatively comfortable treatment. African American soldiers fought for freedom abroad while facing discrimination at home. But in its treatment of enemy prisoners, America demonstrated a commitment to its stated values. It proved that you could defeat an enemy without becoming like that enemy, that you could be both strong and humane, that you could fight a war without abandoning your principles. This wasn't naive idealism. It was strategic wisdom. By treating German POWs well, America accomplished several things. It encouraged German soldiers to surrender rather than fight to the death. It provided a positive example of democratic values in action, and it laid groundwork for post-war reconciliation. The prisoners who returned to Germany became unofficial ambassadors for American values. When the Marshall Plan began rebuilding Europe, many Germans were receptive, partly because men like Hans Muller and George Gartner had already told them that Americans could be trusted. In 1976, 30 years after his repatriation, Hans Muller returned to America as a tourist. He visited the camp in Texas, where he had been held. The buildings were gone, replaced by a housing development, but he stood there for a long time, remembering. He later wrote, "People ask me what I learned from being a prisoner of war in America. I tell them I learned that the measure of a civilization is not just how it treats its friends, but how it treats its enemies. I learned that democracy is not weakness, that kindness is not naivety, and that sometimes the greatest victories are won not on battlefields, but in the daily choice to treat others with dignity." The story of German POWs in America is not a story of American perfection. It's a story of what happens when a nation tries to live up to its ideals, even during the stress and anger of total war. It's a reminder that how we treat those we have every reason to hate says more about who we are than anything else. In the end, America won more than a military victory over Nazi Germany. It won a moral victory as well, one that was witnessed by 425,000 enemy soldiers who could not believe that Americans gave them kind treatment and food, and whose lives were changed forever by that unexpected encounter with humanity.